A couple of years ago, I had a close call at a train station during my regular commute home. It was one of those stations I had used so many times that I didn't really think about it anymore. Same platform, same timing, same routine, almost every day. That evening wasn't particularly busy, but it also wasn't empty. There were enough people around that you had to be aware of your surroundings, but not so many that it felt crowded. I remember I got there a little earlier than usual, so I was just standing near the middle of the platform waiting for the train to arrive. The ground was slightly damp from earlier rain, and you could see a thin layer of moisture on the platform surface, especially closer to the edge. It wasn't slippery enough to be obvious, but it was there. While I was waiting, I noticed a maintenance worker further down the platform checking something near the edge. He was crouched down, looking into the gap between the train tracks and the platform, then stood up and walked off after a minute. I didn't think much of it at the time. Stuff like that happens all the time in places like that. A few minutes later, I heard the train approaching. You could feel it before you really saw it, that low vibration through the ground and the rails. People around me started to shift slightly closer to the edge, not aggressively, just that small, almost automatic movement everyone makes when a train is about to arrive. I did the same thing without really thinking about it. When the train pulled in, it didn't stop perfectly aligned right away. It slowed, adjusted slightly, and then came to a full stop with a small jolt. I noticed the gap between the train and the platform was a bit wider than usual where I was standing. Not dramatically wide, just enough that you could see more of the tracks below than normal. Again, nothing that felt dangerous at the time. The doors opened and people started getting off. I stepped back slightly to let them pass, then moved forward again as the flow shifted. That's when I noticed someone just ahead of me drop something. It looked like a phone, and it slipped out of their hand as they were stepping toward the train. It didn't fall onto the platform. It went straight into the gap. There was a brief pause, like their brain hadn't caught up yet, and then they reacted instantly. They stepped closer to the edge and leaned down, trying to see where it had landed. At that point, things were still normal. Annoying maybe, but not dangerous. People drop things all the time. The problem was how everything else lined up after that. Someone behind me moved forward at the same time I did, probably trying to get onto the train before the doors closed. There wasn't much space, and I felt a slight bump from behind, not enough to knock me off balance, just enough to push me a step closer to the edge than I intended. My foot landed near the platform edge, right where the surface was slightly damp. I felt it slip just a little. Not enough to fall, but enough to throw off my balance for a second. At the same time, the person in front of me leaned further down, reaching toward the gap, trying to grab their phone. That movement brought them partially into my space. Now I had less room to adjust. I tried to step back to regain balance, but someone else behind me had already moved into that space. For a moment, I was stuck between people, slightly off balance, right at the edge of the platform. Then the train shifted. Just a small adjustment as the doors stayed open, like the brakes releasing pressure for a second. But that small movement changed the gap. I felt it more than saw it. The space between the train and the platform widened slightly, then settled again. The person in front of me reacted to that movement by pulling back suddenly. And in doing that, they bumped into me. That was the moment everything tipped. My foot, already on the damp surface near the edge, lost traction completely. I felt it slide forward toward the gap. My weight shifted with it before I could correct it. For a split second, I was leaning forward with nothing solid under one foot. I tried to catch myself by stepping with the other foot, but there wasn't enough space. That's when my foot went into the gap. Not fully, but far enough that I felt it drop between the platform and the train. My body followed slightly, and I grabbed onto the edge of the train doorway with both hands. The metal was wet and cold, and for a second, I wasn't sure if I had a solid grip. Everything around me blurred for a moment. People reacting. Someone shouting. I pulled myself upward as hard as I could, trying to get my foot back onto the platform. It caught slightly on the edge before coming free. I stumbled backward, away from the gap, almost bumping into the people behind me again. For a second, I just stood there, trying to process what had just happened. My heart was racing, and my hands were shaking more than I expected. I looked down at the gap again. It didn't look any different than it had a minute earlier. Just a slightly wider space than usual. Nothing that would stand out unless you were already paying attention to it. That's when everything started to line up in my head. The damp platform, the wider than normal gap, the dropped phone, the slight push from behind, the train shifting at the wrong moment. Each one of those things on its own wouldn't have caused a problem, but together they created a situation where I lost control for just a second, and that was enough. If I hadn't grabbed onto the train when I did, I would have gone further down into the gap. If the train had moved again at that moment, I don't think I would have had time to react. The doors closed a minute later like nothing had happened. People got on and off, and the train eventually pulled away. Everything went back to normal almost immediately. But for me, it didn't feel normal anymore. Ever since then, I don't stand as close to the edge when I'm waiting. And I definitely don't assume that something as simple as stepping onto a train is completely safe. Because sometimes it's not one big mistake that puts you in danger. It's a series of small, ordinary things that all happen at the same time.